Imagine if you stepped onto a wooden dock in the dead of Alaskan winter. The boards creak under your boots, ice clings to every surface, and the harbor lies ahead silent, still, as if holding its breath. You cast off the ropes of a small boat, thinking it will be nothing more than an afternoon on the water. The tide pulls you outward, the world shrinks behind you. The last sight anyone has of you is your silhouette against the pale glow of the snow fog. And then you're gone. That is exactly what happened to three friends in the winter of 2013. What began as a casual day trip out of Sitka, Alaska, turned into one of the state's most haunting maritime mysteries. Their bodies would not be seen again until months later, in circumstances so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to put words to the scene. But to understand what happened, you need to know who they were. There was Daniel Whitaker, 35 years old. Born and raised in Anchorage. A mechanic by trade, he had an almost stubborn relationship with machines. He believed every problem could be fixed if you had the patience to understand it. Daniel had recently divorced and was trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy. The boat, a modest 20-foot fishing vessel he'd purchased secondhand, had become his anchor. Then there was Josh Heller, 27, a wildlife photographer who had relocated from Oregon to Alaska, chasing the promise of raw, untouched wilderness. His photographs captured the severity of the landscape. Bald eagles hunched on snow-laden branches, whales breaching through sheets of fog, derelict fishing boats frozen in ice. Josh was restless, always chasing something just out of frame, as though Alaska itself held an answer to his private questions. And finally, Matthew Caro, 31, a high school history teacher in Sitka. He was quiet, meticulous, with a fascination for local folklore. He was the one who carried maps folded neatly in his pocket, who spoke of the indigenous stories about harbors that swallowed men whole, about the silent watchers of the water. His students adored him. His colleagues knew him as reserved but deeply observant. The three men had grown close over the past year. Sitka is a place where bonds form quickly. Long winters, isolation, and the constant fight against the elements foster an intimacy few outsiders understand. For Daniel, Josh, and Matthew, the boat became more than transportation. It was a ritual, a way to escape the noise of town, to carve out a piece of silence in a world where silence itself felt threatening. February 2nd, 2013. The sun never fully rose that day. A thin light seeped through the clouds like diluted ink, casting the town in perpetual twilight. Temperatures hovered around 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Locals remember it as one of those days when the cold pressed against your ribs, sinking deeper. With every breath, the three men set out from Crescent Harbor in the late morning. Witnesses saw them loading gear into Daniel's boat: fishing equipment, a cooler, cameras, and an old thermos of coffee. They wore thick parkas and insulated gloves. Nothing out of the ordinary. Their plan, according to Daniel's ex-wife, was simple: an afternoon excursion into the channel, maybe to photograph wildlife, maybe to fish. They expected to be back before dusk. At 11:47 a.m., a harbor security camera caught their boat leaving the dock. That grainy footage is the last official sighting of the three friends alive. They never returned. When night fell and the boat failed to return, concern grew quickly. Sitka is no stranger to maritime accidents. The sea is both lifeblood and executioner here. Families called in, the Coast Guard was alerted, and by midnight, search efforts had begun. The initial search seemed promising. Weather was stable, with low winds and manageable swells. Helicopters swept the channels with floodlights, while patrol vessels traced the coastline. What baffled rescuers was the absence of any sign: no flare, no radio call, no drifting debris. The ocean, vast as it was, usually gave something back. Not this time. The following morning, the Coast Guard expanded its grid. Dozens of square miles were combed, radar scans pinged across the inlets, and search dogs were deployed along the shoreline. Hours turned to days, then days into a week. By the seventh day, authorities officially suspended the operation. No wreckage. No bodies. No clues. The boat and the three men had simply vanished into the silence of the sea. The town reeled. Sitka is a small community where everyone knows each other's names, where each face is familiar. The loss of three men, each woven into the fabric of daily life, was like a tear spreading through cloth. Memorials appeared on the pier. Photographs, candles flickering against the biting wind, handwritten notes pinned to the wood with fishhooks for their families. The lack of closure was unbearable. Daniel's ex-wife, Sarah, kept his garage exactly as it had been, tools lined neatly on the pegboard, oil-stained rags folded on the workbench. She admitted later that she sometimes stood there at night, listening for the sound of his boots. Josh's sister flew in from Oregon, refusing to leave until the case was solved. She spent hours walking the shoreline, convinced anything would wash up. And Matthew's students left flowers outside his empty classroom, their notes written in pencil on torn notebook pages. The silence became its own torment. Months passed. The winter ice loosened its grip, and spring thawed the channels. By then, the case had nearly slipped from the headlines, overtaken by new tragedies and new stories. But Sitka never forgot. The harbor, once a place of livelihood, now carried a shadow. People swore they could feel it, standing on the pier at night, the sense that something was just beneath the water, waiting. Then, on May 17th, a fisherman made a disturbing report. While securing his boat at dawn, he noticed something unnatural, a strip of fabric frozen into the underside of the pier. At first, he thought it was nothing, discarded clothing caught in the ice. But when he tugged at it, the fabric didn't come free. It was stuck, embedded. Authorities were called. Divers entered the harbor, braving the black water where visibility was less than a foot. What they found was enough to reopen the entire case. Strapped beneath the pier, their bodies preserved in the icy water, were Daniel, Josh, and Matthew. Bound by heavy ropes to the wooden pylons, their lifeless forms swayed with the tide. They had not drowned at sea, nor vanished into the wilderness. They had been here all along, hidden in plain sight, tethered beneath the very harbor from which they had set sail. The discovery was horrifying. Sitka was paralyzed with fear. How had three grown men ended up tied beneath the pier in the very heart of town? Who had done it? And most chillingly, why had no one noticed for months? Divers resurfaced with grim news. There were no immediate signs of the boat, no evidence of how the men had been placed there. But the precision of the knots, the method of restraint, told investigators one thing with certainty. This was no accident. This was murder. The town's grief transformed overnight into dread. Questions multiplied. Suspicion spread like cracks. In ice, was the killer someone from Sitka? Someone who knew the tides, the harbor, the shadows of the pylons? And if so, were they still watching? The case had just begun. And what investigators were about to uncover would reveal not only the cruelty of the crime, but also the dark obsession that had hidden in Sitka's heart for years. The recovery of the three bodies from beneath the frozen pier was not just gruesome, it was precise. Investigators quickly realized this was not the chaotic result of drunken recklessness or some maritime mishap. The method of binding, the deliberate concealment, spoke of intent. Someone had wanted Daniel, Josh, and Matthew hidden. And hidden well. The ropes that secured the men were thick, waterlogged, and tied with knots most people wouldn't recognize. But one diver, a former Navy man, noticed immediately. These were clove hitches and half hitches, knots favored in maritime labor, knots that held firm against current and tide. Whoever had tied them knew the harbor, knew the pylons beneath the pier, and perhaps most chillingly knew that the freezing water would preserve the bodies long enough to escape suspicion. Sitka had never seen anything like it. The autopsies revealed details that sent ripples through the town. The men had not drowned. Their lungs held no seawater. Instead, each bore bruising on the wrists and ankles, marks consistent with restraint. Before being strapped beneath the pier. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head for Daniel and Matthew, a fractured skull and crushed temple. For Josh, it was different: manual strangulation, the crushing of his windpipe. All three deaths were violent. All three were deliberate, but the timing puzzled investigators. Medical examiners determined the men had likely died within hours of their disappearance on February 2nd, yet their placement beneath the pier suggested forethought and careful concealment. The harbor is busy, even in winter. Fishermen and harbor workers cross the docks daily. To tie three bodies under the pier without notice seemed impossible. Unless investigators thought it was done in darkness, at a time when no one would have been around. That raised another question. Did the killer strike at sea and later return to hide the bodies in the harbor? Or had the crime occurred right here, on land, before anyone realized the men were missing? The biggest mystery was still the boat. Daniel's vessel had vanished. There were no reports of it drifting ashore, no debris, no wreckage. If the murders had occurred at sea, the boat should have been found, or at least pieces of it. If the murders had occurred in the harbor, then the boat had been deliberately removed. The Coast Guard launched a secondary search, dragging the channels and scanning with sonar. Weeks passed. Nothing. It was as if the vessel had been erased from existence. And with its absence grew suspicion. Sitka, usually a community bound by weather and hardship, turned inward. Suspicion spread. Every fisherman who knew his knots, every dock worker who had access to the pier, became a potential suspect in the whispered theories that swirled through town. Sarah Whitaker, Daniel's ex-wife, spoke publicly at a vigil. She believed the killer had to be local. No outsider could have done this, she said, voice breaking. They knew where to put them, where no one would look. Her words hung heavy. Because if the killer was local, then the killer was still here. Shopping at the same stores. Standing in the same lines, watching. Matthew's students, once leaving flowers at the school, now wrote in hushed notes about monsters hiding in plain sight. Josh's sister, who refused to leave town, began approaching fishermen directly, asking them about the knots, about the boat, about the cold night of February 2nd. She was met with stony silence. People in Sitka did not like to be accused. But beneath the defensiveness was something else: fear. Then came a revelation that unsettled everyone further. Investigators combing through harbor logs discovered an entry written by the harbor master. On the night the men vanished. At 2:14 a.m., long after the boat was reported overdue, he had noted unusual movement near the pier. He described a figure, or maybe two, carrying something heavy across the dock. At first he assumed it was fishermen returning late, but what struck him in hindsight was the silence. No voices, no chatter, no lights. Just shadows and the sound of dragging weight across ice. When questioned, the harbor master admitted he hadn't reported it sooner because he wasn't sure what he had seen. The night was foggy, visibility low. But the logbook entry was there. Undeniable. Someone had been at the pier that night. And they had been carrying something heavy. The implications were terrifying. Had the bodies been tied beneath the pier the very night the men disappeared? Right under the noses of investigators, family, and friends who searched the sea while the victims lay below their feet? Forensics found something else in the retrieval, a personal object that broke the investigators' composure. Wedged between two pylons near where Matthew's body had been tied was an old green thermos. The same thermos seen in the harbor camera. Footage, tucked under Daniel's arm as the three men set out. Inside, still sealed, was lukewarm coffee. It meant only one thing. Whatever had happened, it had occurred quickly. There had been no long journey at sea, no days stranded on the water. Within hours of leaving the dock, the men had been dead, and their killer had been efficient enough to place even their belongings back beneath the pier, as if mocking the investigators. Theories spiraled out of control. Some believed it was organized crime, a warning, a display of power. Others whispered about personal vendettas. Daniel's divorce was bitter, his debts mounting. Josh had clashed with several locals who accused him of trespassing on private land for his photographs. Matthew, with his quiet curiosity, had asked too many questions about old stories of the harbor, but speculation, however dark, could not answer the central question. How had 3 men been killed, bound, and hidden beneath the pier without anyone seeing? Authorities requested FBI assistance, citing the disturbing nature of the crime. Agents arrived, and with them came silence. The case details were sealed, records kept confidential. Sitka, once buzzing with rumor, fell into a fearful quiet. Yet, silence has a way of amplifying fear. Months later, during a routine maintenance dive, harbor workers stumbled upon something in the silt further out from the pier. At first, it looked like debris, but as they brushed away the sediment, metal gleamed through the dark water that it was the hull of a boat 20 feet long. Partially buried in silt and seaweed, its cabin collapsed inward. Serial numbers confirmed it. Daniel's vessel. The missing boat had been here all along, sunk just beyond the harbor, invisible to surface searches. But the divers saw something else, something that froze them more than the wreck itself. Scratched into the metal near the stern were letters. Not painted, not etched with a tool, but carved, jagged and frantic, by hand. The words carved into the boat under the pier were like a wound torn open. For investigators, it was both revelation and horror. It meant that at least one of the 3 friends had still been alive when the vessel began to sink. Someone, in their last desperate moments, had clawed a message into the hull. They knew. Where they would be left. It was not just a clue. It was a scream from the grave. Forensic analysis determined the scratches were made from the inside, with a blade or sharp edge. The frantic gouges suggested panic. They were shallow in some places. Deep in others, the erratic scrawl of someone running out of time. The letters were carved before the hull was fully submerged. This changed everything. The murders had not been swift executions. They had been orchestrated. Someone had staged the deaths with precision, sinking the boat to erase evidence while leaving the men beneath the pier as hidden trophies. And Sitka was not ready for that reality. The FBI broadened its focus. Anyone with access to the harbor came under scrutiny. Fishermen, dock workers, mechanics, even law enforcement. The town's easy rhythm of trust dissolved overnight. Neighbors stopped making eye contact. Doors were locked earlier. Children were told not to wander near the pier. Sitka, usually a place of resilience against the wild, turned against itself. Rumors spread like frost across glass. Sarah Whitaker, Daniel's ex-wife, came under brief suspicion. The divorce had been bitter. Custody of their daughter fought tooth and nail. But Sarah's alibi was solid. She had been out of town that weekend, confirmed by credit card records and hotel logs. Attention shifted. Josh had photographed old cannery sites, abandoned cabins, places some locals didn't want documented. Had he angered someone protective of secrets? Matthew had dug into harbor folklore, asking questions that pried at old wounds. Had his curiosity stirred something dangerous? The possibility loomed that the motive was not personal, but territorial. Someone wanted the 3 men silenced because of what they saw, what they asked, or what they stumbled upon. One of the strangest leads came from Matthew's students. Weeks before the disappearance, he had been teaching a lesson about Alaska's maritime history. A student recalled him mentioning how in the old days, punishment for betrayal or theft among crews was to be lashed to harbor pilings at low tide, left to drown as the sea rose. The story seemed almost too close to the fate the 3 men suffered. Investigators wondered if Matthew himself had mentioned the tale to the wrong person. or if someone had revived the ancient punishment as a macabre ritual. The pattern, the binding, the concealment beneath the pier suddenly looked less random and more symbolic. One of the divers who helped recover the boat provided a detail that was overlooked at first. The stern of the vessel had been weighed down with chains, industrial grade, the kind used for mooring larger ships. These chains weren't something Daniel kept on his boat. Someone had added them deliberately, ensuring the vessel would sink. Quickly. When investigators asked harbor suppliers about recent purchases of chain, records showed nothing. But one supplier admitted that in Sitka, chains often disappeared quietly, taken from abandoned lots or scrap piles near the shipyards. Anyone familiar with the harbor could have obtained them without raising suspicion, which again narrowed the suspect pool to insiders. Then came another haunting discovery. During a dredge operation near the sunken boat, divers recovered a waterproof case. Inside was a camera, Josh's confirmed by serial number. Its memory card was intact. When investigators powered it on, there were several dozen photographs from the day of the trip. The last few frames shook them. One showed the three men laughing on the deck, horizon behind them blurred with fog. Another showed a stretch of water, empty but foreshadowed land in the distance. And then the final frame, a figure standing on the pier. It was blurred, taken from the boat as it left the harbor, zoomed in as if Josh had noticed something unusual. The figure was tall, shoulders hunched, wearing a heavy parka. Their face was obscured by a hood. The photo offered no definitive identity, but the implication was chilling. Someone had been watching them leave, and that someone may have known they weren't coming back. As weeks dragged on, Sitka itself seemed to unravel. The FBI's presence suffocated the town. Bars once filled with easy laughter fell quiet. People whispered about being questioned, about agents following them home. More unsettling were the silences, the things no one wanted to say. Fishermen who might have seen something swore they hadn't. Dockworkers avoided questions about movements on the night of February 2nd. Even the harbor master, whose journal entry had been so crucial, grew less cooperative, insisting he'd been mistaken, that maybe what he saw had been nothing at all. It was as if the entire town had decided that the less said, the better. And beneath that silence, paranoia festered. One investigator, staying late near the harbor, began noticing patterns. Every night, just past midnight, a light appeared briefly on the pier, a faint lantern glow, not bright enough to be official work. Each time, by the time agents reached the dock, the light was gone. No footprints, no movement. Just the echo of water slapping against the pylons. Locals whispered about the pier watcher, someone returning night after night as if to check their work. Some said it was the killer, unable to resist revisiting the scene. Others said it was someone protecting a secret no one dared to name. In July of that year, a reporter covering the case filed a public records request for the Coast Guard's initial search logs. What came back shocked her. Several pages were missing, pages detailing radar anomalies recorded the night of February 2nd. The official response was that the documents had been misplaced. But sources inside suggested otherwise. The anomalies, they claimed, showed an unidentified vessel leaving the harbor late that night, heading into the fog. Not Daniel's boat, something larger, slower. A vessel that had never been accounted for. Was this boat involved in the disposal of the victims? Was it used to move the chains, to sink the vessel? If so, who owned it? The missing file deepened. Suspicions that someone was protecting the truth. The break investigators needed came not from high-tech forensics, but from something simple. A rope sample recovered from beneath the pier was analyzed more closely. It bore a distinct dye, uncommon in ordinary rope, but used by one specific supplier for commercial fishing fleets. That supplier sold almost exclusively to Sitka's largest cannery. A cannery with decades of history, long intertwined with the harbor, employing generations of locals. Suddenly, the investigation narrowed. The killer wasn't just anyone familiar with knots and tides. They were connected to the cannery. The cannery was more than a workplace in Sitka. It was a monument to the town's history, a sprawling, weather-beaten structure smelling of salt and brine, where machinery clanged late into the night. But behind its walls were rumors, disputes over wages, strange accidents hushed up, a culture of silence where loyalty was valued above law. And now, investigators had reason to believe that the very ropes binding Daniel, Josh, and Matthew had come from its supply. The question was no longer whether the killer was local. It was which one of Sitka's own, tied to its oldest industry, had carried out the most meticulous murders the town had ever seen. The agents prepared to interview the cannery foreman, a man known for his strict control of the docks. But before they could, something else happened, something that suggested the killer was not finished. Late one night, as autumn storms battered Sitka, a security guard patrolling the cannery grounds reported hearing a rhythmic thumping from beneath the pier. At first he thought it was machinery or waves. But when he leaned closer, he swore it sounded like fists, like someone knocking from underneath the water. The guard's report of the thumping beneath the pier sent shivers through investigators already worn down by months of silence. They feared. At first it was hysteria, a product of a town spiraling into paranoia. But the man was adamant. He had leaned close, and the sound had been unmistakable. Knocks, rhythmic like someone signaling. Divers were dispatched immediately, descending once again into the black, heaving waters beneath Sitka's pier. What they found was not another body, but something almost more unsettling. Wedged between two pilings, tangled in kelp, was a small wooden crate. Inside were fragments of rope, a rusted knife, and an object wrapped in oilcloth. When unwrapped, on the surface, the object revealed itself as a fisherman's logbook. It was water damaged, but entries remained legible. And within those faded pages was a name that cracked the case wide open. The logbook belonged to Elias Morel. The cannery foreman investigators had already been preparing to question. His neat handwriting chronicled tides, shipments, storms, and crew rosters. But interspersed were darker notes, cryptic remarks about trespassers, about those who stir what should be left buried. The final entries, dated the week of the disappearance, were chilling. They asked too many questions. Under the pier is where betrayal belongs. This town forgets too easily. I will remind them. The book was not just evidence. It was confession through obsession. Elias Morel was known as a man of the old ways. His father and grandfather had worked the same cannery, men bound to the tides and hardened by labor. Elias was strict, feared by younger workers for his temper and his unyielding rules. Investigators began piecing together a profile. Elias saw himself not as a murderer, but as a custodian of tradition. The punishment inflicted upon Daniel, Josh, and Matthew was not random, it was ritual. A revival of the old harbor law Matthew had once told his class about, lashed beneath the pier, drowned by the tide, erased by the sea. Elias hadn't just killed them. He had performed judgment. When federal agents confronted Elias at the cannery, he didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply set down the tools he was carrying and asked, "Who talked?" In custody, Elias spoke little, but what he did reveal was haunting. He claimed the three men had been snooping where they didn't belong, photographing abandoned sites, dredging up stories that would have ruined families. He said they mocked the harbor with their curiosity, treating Sitka's history as spectacle. They thought the sea was a backdrop, Elias muttered. But the sea is a judge. He never admitted the full sequence of events, how he subdued them, how he bound them, how he sank the boat. But he didn't need to. The evidence, the ropes, the chains, the logbook combined, they painted a complete picture. For the families of Daniel, Josh, and Matthew, the arrest was not relief. It was devastation layered upon devastation. Daniel's daughter, only 8. At the time of his disappearance, asked her mother if the sea had been angry at her dad. Josh's parents couldn't bear to look at the recovered photographs, especially the final blurred image of the hooded figure on the pier, now believed to be Elias. Watching them depart, and Matthew's students, once inspired by his curiosity, now carried a story their teacher had told in jest about the punishment of traitors beneath the pier as his own death sentence. The trial of Elias Morel transfixed Alaska. Prosecutors presented him as a calculating killer who weaponized tradition to mass cruelty. The defense argued insanity, claiming Elias was obsessed with preserving a code of honor no one else remembered. But the jury saw through it. The logbook sealed his fate. Elias was convicted of triple homicide and sentenced to life without parole. Yet even in prison, Elias remained unrepentant. He told interviewers that Sitka should thank him, that without his actions, outsiders would have ruined the harbor. His voice carried the conviction of a man who believed murder was duty. Even with the verdict, Sitka did not heal. The pier became a place avoided by locals, its weathered wood no longer a symbol of livelihood, but of horror. Fishermen muttered about curses. Tourists asked questions that made residents turn away. The cannery tried to distance itself from Elias, but its shadow remained. Workers who had once joked about the foreman's temper now spoke in whispers about nights he'd kept them late, about warnings he'd muttered of what happens to betrayers. And beneath it all, one question lingered: had Elias acted alone? Because the anomaly in the Coast Guard logs, the unidentified vessel that slipped out into the fog the night of February 2nd, was never explained. Elias never admitted to using another boat, nor to having help. Some investigators believed he had an accomplice, someone who had since gone silent. Others thought Elias staged the entire operation alone, dragging chains and victims with the strength of a man who had lived his life at sea. But the unanswered question haunted the case. If there was another boat, where had it gone? And who had been at its helm? Years later, locals would still tell the story with a tremor in their voices, about how three men set out to chase photographs and memories, and ended up woven into Sitka's darkest tradition. Some swore they could hear knocking beneath the pier on stormy nights. Others claimed to see a lantern glow flicker at midnight, the ghost of Elias himself, returning to check the ropes he once tied. And children, warned away from the harbor, whispered that the sea remembers. That to ask too many questions, to pry into what's buried, is to invite judgment. The case of Daniel, Josh, and Matthew was never just about 3 lives stolen. It was about the clash between curiosity and control, memory and silence. It was about how one man turned history into weapon, and how a town allowed silence to protect him until it was too late. Imagine standing on that pier today. The boards creak under your feet. The tide pulls against the pylons. Beneath you, in the dark water, is where 3 men were bound and left to die hidden in plain sight. Just yards from shore, the harbor looks the same as it always did. But for those who know, it will never feel the same, because Sitka learned, in the most brutal way, that cruelty doesn't need the wilderness to hide. Sometimes it hides beneath the pier, in the shadows of tradition, waiting for the next set of eyes that dare to look too closely.